Well, thank you very much. I am not sure if you can actually hear me. If I could have, I see the auditorium. If I could have a very quick visual, if you can just like wave your hands, if you can actually hear me. Wonderful! It is amazing. I am excited to be here with you today. And I will, for the next hour, take you on what I think will be a pretty wild ride into the future. And we will discuss, and I will show you a couple of our insights, our tools, our frameworks. And I will give you very concrete ideas and practical advice on how to make sure that the future just doesn't happen to you, but that you are going to be an active participant in this future. Now, with that being said, let me start my screen share so you can actually see my slides. And then we are going to go into our session. Again, a very warm welcome here. I am currently in Boulder, Colorado. It is about 10 o'clock in the evening. So you have me at my most productive. I love being up in the evening. And with that being said, let's talk about the future. Now, here's the thing. I actually like to start, and you will see end, my presentations with a quote. And this particular quote is from a gentleman called Jorge Paulo Lemann. And Jorge Paulo Lemann is a hedge fund manager at one of the world's largest hedge funds out of Brazil called 3G Capital. And I give him a lot of credit because at the Milken conference just about 2 years ago, in front of running cameras, in front of his peers, he said the following. He said, "I am a terrified dinosaur. I've been living in this cozy world of old brands, big volumes. Nothing changes very much, and you could just focus on being very efficient and you'd be okay. And all of a sudden, we're being disrupted in all ways." And I think what Jorge here expresses is how we're feeling about this world. Notwithstanding even that we go through like a massive pandemic, but the world is changing at a really interesting rate. So we want to unpack this today, and I want to give you a bunch of tools and frameworks and ideas on how to be better stewards of this future. Now, I have a couple of lean-in exercises for you where I actually want you to contemplate something. Here's an interesting sentence. This is a sentence stub. It's not a full sentence. The future is blank. And what I would love for you to do, just for 1 second, think about what is the word, the first word which comes to your mind when you see this sentence. How would you complete the sentence? And we've done this. I've done this exercise with hundreds and times with thousands of people. And you hear and see if that is true for you. You hear stuff like, the future is today, the future is now, the future is exciting, the future is ours. But also people saying, well, looking at, for example, climate change, the future is pretty scary, or the future is uncertain. Here's the thing. We believe, and this is the first little bit of like change in your perspective, which I want to offer you, is that we believe that the future is actually what we call a paradox. The future is all of these things at the same time. The future is bright and crazy and interesting, and at the same time it's also scary. But also if you're thinking about the future as seeing the future, perceiving the future, thinking about the future as something which expands. And I believe you lost my slides there. It kind of looks, at least for me, like that way. So let me just like talk through my slides and we will see if we can get this back. But the future is a paradox. And the future, when we say paradox, on one hand, again, it has a lot to do with like how you see the future. But it also has something to do with the fact that you don't know what the future will look like. We can't predict the future. And by the way, my friends in the AV booth, if you want me to pause for a second and you like fix something, just please do let me know. I'm very happy to pause for a second and we'll get my slides back up if that helps.
Yes, sir. Can we have a minute? We have a small glitch.
Absolutely. So while our friends on the AV side get my slides back up, think about this paradox a little bit more. And let me just briefly talk about the paradox for one more second. Because here's the thing about the paradox. On one hand, you have people like me who tell you that you can't predict the future. We can't say what the future will be. That's the beauty of the future. You create the future every single day. And then on the other hand, when you look very carefully, and we'll explore this today a little bit together, you can actually make pretty good predictions about the future. And there's my slides again and my face. So we're good. We're back in business. Now, that being said, let me share something else with you about the future, because this is how I would like you to think about the future going forward. If you put yourself where the little red dot is, and you think about the time as an expanding timeline, there's a future which is a day from now, there's a future which is a week, a month, a year, 10 years from now. What most of us do is we think about the future as a progression of the past, a continuation of the past. We call this the official future. We believe that the future is just a continuation of where we came from. What I offer you is this. We believe, and like the futurist community will show you this, that there's actually an expanding cone of probable futures surrounded by an even bigger cone of possible futures. And I believe your role as a leader, particularly those of you who are students, who are at the earlier starts of the earlier points in your career, our role as a leader is to understand what are the upper and the lower boundaries of these cones. What are the possible futures look like, and what are the probable futures which are embedded inside of those look like. And then it is our opportunity, maybe our obligation, to create the future we want. Because there's not a single future, there's a multitude of futures for us to explore. And that's, my friend, what we're going to dig in today. Because I'm going to turn you in the next 55 minutes into what we like to call a practical futurist. We will give you the tools. You will walk out of this auditorium with a tool set to become a practical futurist. Now, here's everything you need to know about the future, summarized in a single slide. And I am pretty sure you've seen that slide before. Of course, it's the exponential curve. We know that technology moves on these exponentially accelerating timelines. Think about Moore's law. Computers are getting twice as fast every 2 years. He observed this more than 50 years ago. It has been true for 50 years. Classic exponential trend. Now, I will not bore you with that stuff because I'm pretty sure you know this. But I want to point something out. If you are standing somewhere where this gentleman stands here, and you're looking to the past, and remember, everything we know, everything we've built our lives on is based on our understanding of the past. If you look to the past, you realize that the past is flat and linear. If you have the ability to see the future, you realize the future is weird, it's strange, it's steep. There's a really beautiful way to express this, and this goes back to Ernest Hemingway, which of course the face, you might have seen this, the face on this little stick figure is Ernest Hemingway. He wrote a book called The Sun Also Rises, which some say is his best book, like his best work. In this book is a quote. That quote we have taken completely out of context, but the quote is very, very good and describes us exactly at this point in time. And we like to call this the Hemingway law of motion. And the shortest version of that quote is this: gradually and then suddenly. Because what happens to us is that these changes, these things which happen to us in the world, they feel like for a long time nothing really changes, and then suddenly, boom, the world changed. Think about the world before the iPhone or Android phones. We had smartphones before that for decades. But really, it took a long time for them to mature. But then once Steve Jobs in 2007 gets on stage, and we'll explore this a little bit further later, the world changed very suddenly. Which brings us to an important point, because I believe it is incredibly important for you, and this is our first skill we want to explore. The necessity to be able to read what the futurist Amy Webb once called weak signals, the early indicators of change, the early part of that exponential curve. Or as the historian Fernand Braudel once called this, the thin wisps of tomorrow. And as Rob Walker, who's another colleague of ours, he's a futurist, once pointed out, he said that there are no shortcuts when you think about the future. When you want to see these early indicators of change, there are no algorithms. And if all you do is tracking what's trending, then all you ever know is what everybody else knows. To discover, you have to dig. And I want to show you how digging looks like, so you have a blueprint for it. And to do so, I want to give you a very concrete example. And we're going to talk about computers, because they are really the mother of all exponential trends. And here's the thing, I will not bore you to death with the old adage that your smartphone is now as powerful as a supercomputer was in the 70s. You heard that story. I want to show you something different. And I want to use this again to illustrate how you start digging. This here is a digital counter for about $3. The way they work is you use them once. They tell you can only use them once. It's a one-use device. They tell you if you're pregnant or not on the little strip, and hopefully you're happy about the result. A computer hacker at the beginning of the pandemic, so about a year and a half ago, got curious about this, because they looked at this and said, it's a curious device. We know it's a digital device. It's a computer, right? But we don't think about it as a computer. We think about it as a disposable device. So our friend, the computer hacker, bought one of those devices. It's not particularly expensive, $3. And then they started digging, and they started taking that thing apart. And what they found inside of this is rather interesting. First of all, they found that this digital pregnancy test, at its core, is a normal pregnancy test. You might know these tests with the 2 lines. There's a little sensor reading those 2 lines, sending the data to a little chip, which is powered by a battery and shows you on the display if you're pregnant or not. Again, this is a single-use device. Now, the first question you can ask yourself is, why would you even do this? If it's the same thing as the old test, why would you do it? Well, the response, of course, or the answer to that is, it's a very high-stress environment for a lot of people. We get pretty confused. We seem to be getting pretty confused if we're pregnant, if there's 1 or 2 lines. So it kind of makes sense to have a device which says very clearly, you're pregnant, yes or no. But the computer hacker didn't stop here. And this is what I want to teach you. Don't stop asking questions. The computer hacker looked at this and said, well, listen, this is a $3 device. Retail. So manufacturing this device can't be that expensive. I wonder how expensive the chip on this device is, the little computer which powers this device. And I also wonder how powerful the chip is. So the computer hacker started digging. And what they found is rather interesting. The chip on this device costs less than $30. So very cheap. But the chip on this device also has the same compute power as the original IBM PC. The very device which kick-started the PC revolution, the very device which gave us Word and Excel and computer games, the very device which allowed Bill Gates to build his empire on, now in a device which you don't even think about as a computer anymore. And because we're computer hackers, we put the computer game Doom on there, so the next time you're waiting for your pregnancy test results, you can play a round of Doom. I'm not quite sure what that means about humanity, but here's the thing. You might look at this and you say, well, this is interesting. You might smile about this. You might say, well, we've come a long way, Pascal. But I look at this and I say, wait a second. What is that a weak signal for? And this is where it gets interesting. Because computers used to be roomfuls of electronics. They used to be mainframe computers. And then we made them smaller and they became the size of a fridge. They were mini computers. And then we made them smaller and they became the size so small that we can put them on your desktop. They became personal computers. And then we made them smaller and we can put them into your backpack. So now you can walk around with them. And then we made them smaller and we made them so small that they fit into your back pocket. And then, and this is where we are right now, we're making them so small that, as my friend and researcher Alan Wurfs-Brock likes to say, they become ambient. They become so small that they're just there. You don't even think about them as computers anymore. And here's the important insight. Every time we moved from one compute era to the next, every time the world changed from one compute era to the next, the world at large changed. And not just a little bit. The world changed dramatically. And not just the world itself, but also the companies which dominated this world. Mainframes were dominated by IBM. PCs dominated by Microsoft. Your mobile devices clearly dominated by Apple and Google and maybe Samsung and a few other manufacturers. And now we're moving into a world where we'll see billions of these devices you don't even think about as computers anymore. And that world, I am pretty sure, will not be dominated by any of those companies. So it's a really fascinating world. And then, of course, the moment you start digging, you see these signals popping up everywhere. You know, it's like the stuff you see here on this slide that isn't even a weak signal anymore. Most of that stuff is very much in our lives already. You know, digital wallets, the transition towards renewable energy, electric vehicles, genetics, space technology. So my invitation for you is, and this is the first bit I want to basically give you as you're now on your way to become a practical futurist, is start digging, start becoming curious about the world. And make no mistake, this is not just happening in the world of technology itself. It is also happening in the world where technology influences us. Here's an interesting example. As a Chinese influencer, he's on like the Chinese social media sites, he's on TikTok, etc. He goes by the nickname, the Lipstick Brother. This is a young gentleman who goes online, has a large following of predominantly a female audience, and you know he like tries on lipsticks and mascara, and it's really fascinating. This in itself, I think, is an interesting signal to spot because we're now talking about gender fluidity. We're talking about a man wearing lipstick. But here's where it gets much more interesting. Our friend the Lipstick Brother, in China we have a one-day online sales event. It's comparable if you're familiar with Black Friday in the United States or Amazon Prime Day. This one is called Alibaba's Single Day. And what happens on Alibaba's Single Day is Alibaba sells, like Alibaba and all the other online retailers, sell tons and tons and tons of goods in a 24-hour period. Our friend the Lipstick Brother went online for 24 hours and sold, like just decorative cosmetics, lipstick and all that good stuff by streaming to his audience. And here's a fascinating thing. Within 24 hours, in a single day, 24 hours, the Lipstick Brother sold $2 billion worth of merchandise. That is a weak signal. It's actually a weak signal which has become pretty strong. But it points us towards a world which is dramatically shifting. Now that brings up an important question, which is not every weak signal will turn into a strong signal. And the question becomes, how do you identify which weak signal might turn into a strong signal and when will that happen? And that gets us to the second point I want to make today. The second piece of learning for your journey towards a practical futurist. And to talk about strong signals, I want to reintroduce our friend the exponential curve. And I want to introduce you to this blue line. Because the blue line is your perception, your expectation of technology. And here's what's happening. At the beginning of many new technologies, we overestimate what the technology is possible, what the technology can do for us. We are so excited about it that we get super excited. But then, once we realize that the technology is actually not keeping up with our excitement, we become disappointed. A very good example for this is if you've seen, back in like 6-7 years ago, Google released Google Glass, these augmented reality glasses. I was working at Google. It's a classic disappointment product because I was so excited about the product. Pardon. And the moment I took them out and the moment I put them on, I realized immediately they're too expensive. The battery life is terrible. The features are terrible. And once I looked into a mirror, I realized you look like an idiot when you wear them. So you become disappointed. Now, the challenge with disappointment is this, though. Very often when we're disappointed, we're dismissing. So we're looking at something, we say it's not good, and then we say it won't be good in the future. Of course, though, technology gets better. And you get to this moment when these lines are crossing, when technology actually is good enough. And we like to call this the iPhone moment. Steve Jobs gets on stage 2007, shows you the iPhone. You realize, oh, wait a second, the phone isn't a phone anymore. Phone is this new wild thing. And then you get into the last phase, which is chaos and amazement, where you can't keep up with the changes we're seeing in the world. This all has been beautifully summarized by Roy Amara. Roy Amara was the co-founder of the Institute for the Future. It's a think tank out of Silicon Valley. And he said we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. And I think that's a very accurate and astute observation, which gets us to an interesting and important insight. When you look at any new technology and you look at its infancy in like the early stages, you realize that it takes years, often decades, for technology to mature. So the good news is, when you see something new popping up, think at the moment, for example, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, if you heard about all of that stuff, you have time. You don't need to jump on this stuff like immediately, because it really takes quite a while for technologies to mature. So much so that even Steve Jobs admitted to this. Steve Jobs, in an interview in Fortune magazine, after the original iPod, not iPhone, iPod came out, and the interviewer asked him, Steve, you're such a visionary, you're so incredible, like you bring these things to life like overnight. And he said that that's not what's happening, my friend. These things happen fairly slowly. And then he goes on and explains like that we need to see these waves of technology, we need to serve them, and it takes years for technology to mature. So, when you look at a weak signal, understand that it takes a while for these weak signals to actually mature. The problem, though, is that once the technology has matured, and you get to this interesting, crossing over point where the world changes, you have no time whatsoever. You typically, once the technology is good enough, you only have between 6 and 18 months before the market leader, the emerging new market leader, is actually being born. So the point here is that as you're looking at a signal, timing becomes the first factor you actually want to look at. And when we think about timing, we want to think about timing in effectively 3 dimensions. You want to look at timing as in how mature and scalable and realistic is the technology, the underlying technology actually. Because here's the thing, and I'm using our friend Elon Musk as an example because Elon happens to have a lot of different technology companies which all do really interesting stuff. And you can actually look at these technology companies through the following lens. There's companies, which are the companies on the left, where the technology, the basic of the technology is actually matured. We know how to scale it. We very well know how to do this. Simple example, Tesla. Just talking about the electric car company, not the autopilot features in Tesla. We know how to build cars. We actually know for 100 years how to scalable build cars. We also know how to build electric vehicles. As a matter of fact, the first vehicles back in the day, 100 years ago, they were electric to start with. We built the combustion engine much later. The same is true for SolarCity, which is the solar panel company. We know how to build solar panels. The Boring Company, which literally drills holes. They bore holes. We know how to do that. And lastly, Starlink, which is this satellite company. We know how to do satellites since Sputnik. Then there's companies which are somewhere in between. So this is where you have a technology which is not fully baked yet. We haven't fully understood it, but we have good reason to believe that it's actually scalable. Good example here, SpaceX. SpaceX's magic is the fact that they can reuse the rocket. To do so, they need to land the rocket. So instead of blowing it up in space or like dumping it into the sea, they need to effectively land the rocket. The technology which makes that possible is a specific design of the fins and a lot of compute technology. But the fin design, which is the really important bit of it, was invented by the Russians in the 50s. So again, we know how to do this. We couldn't do it until SpaceX came along because compute technology wasn't big, like it wasn't there. There was also probably nobody wanting to try it, but we knew how to do it. And then there's a last bucket of companies where we have actually no clue if this actually even works. Like the technology is still in its infancy. Nobody has actually scaled this. A good example, Hyperloop. Hyperloop is this idea that I put you into a effectively vacuum tube, and I instead of a train, I shoot you effectively from, like, let's say San Francisco to LA. Sounds great. The physics sounds amazing. Problem is, there's a million problems inside of the Hyperloop which we have no idea how to solve. One of them, for example, is how do I accelerate this thing and decelerate it without killing the people who are sitting inside of it? Because if I accelerate you too fast, you just like explode, literally, physically explode. So a ton of unsolved problems. So as you're looking at any new technology, any new change, apply this lens to it and ask yourself, how mature is something? You know, just going back to our friend Steve Jobs, the moment he introduced the iPhone, the technology behind that was actually relatively well understood. In 1992, we had the first smartphone. This was a device called Simon, was invented by IBM. In 1993, Apple itself rolled out the Newton, which had a lot of the features you see in the iPhone today, like a touchscreen, etc. 1996, Nokia rolls out the Communicator. It's actually a relatively robust, internet communication device. In 1997, 10 years before the iPhone was released, Palm brings out, or US Robotics at the time, brings out the Palm Pilot, which even looks like an iPhone. So what Steve Jobs needed to do, and make no mistake, this is hard to do, but what Steve Jobs needed to do was, once the technology was matured, once we knew how to scale it, to package it, to bring it together in this beautiful form factor. And make no mistake, that is incredibly hard to do, but we know how to do it. In summary, and this is a quote from IEEE Spectrum magazine, Rodney Brooks, who's a professor, he said that, largely, if the idea builds on practical experience, then guarded optimism is in order. If not, then not. So be careful when you look at a technology and assess it towards its maturity. That's factor number one. But that's not enough. Factor number two is what we like to call Gestalt. Gestalt is a German word. I was born in Germany. And it's an interesting word, an interesting concept. It only exists as such in the German language. It's also one of the few German words, if you know anything about the German language, it's one of the few German words which isn't 26 characters long. But it's, as a concept, it stands and looks at the unified concept. It looks at the holistic view of everything. And this is how we like to use this. When you build something new, there's always a whole bunch of things you can influence, clearly. Like if you build, let's say, the Tesla car, the self-driving car, you can influence the technology which goes into the car, you can put the sensors into the car, you can write the software for the car. But there's a surrounding factor, a universe of things you have no influence over. But you need to monitor them because some of those things can either prevent or accelerate your particular breakthrough. And the way we like to think about this is we like to use the acronym STEEPS for that. We like to ask ourselves, what are the other scientific and technological, environmental and economic, political and social breakthroughs which either need to be made, again, stuff we have no influence over, or which need to be removed for us to be successful. Essentially, what you do is you look at the dependencies. Again, let's talk briefly about Tesla. So if you ever find yourself in a Tesla car self-driving and you're a little confused like this gentleman here, you might ask yourself, well, what is it what Tesla can actually do? Well, clearly, they can develop their own sensors, they can develop their own AI chips as they're doing, they can write their own software, but there's a certain set of factors, which are the dependencies, which Tesla needs to take into account, but has very little control over. Things like, for example, at the moment, nobody knows who's actually liable if a self-driving car has an accident. As long as that isn't solved, at mass, nobody will sit in a self-driving car because you don't know. Are you liable as the driver who actually didn't drive? Is Tesla liable? Is the software engineer liable? Who knows, right? Here's another interesting data point. This data point is literally 2 days old. It came out of a study which has been done. It's a representative study in the United States. And the question was, do you trust AI to drive you in a self-driving car? So this was done across the United States, and what they found is rather interesting. Again, this is a factor which you need to take into account, because if people don't trust sitting in your car, you can do whatever you want. They will not buy your car. And here's the data. So the question was, again, would you trust sitting in a driverless passenger vehicle? 44% said that is a terrible idea. That is a terrible idea for society. I never want to sit in a self-driving car. 29% they're not sure. Only 26% said this is a great idea. So 3/4 of the population in the United States are currently not so sure if they actually want to sit in a self-driving car. Again, a factor you need to take into account as you are thinking about signals. And then the last one is, when you look at the maturity, so now we have looked at the maturity, we see the maturity is actually evolving. You look at the gestalt, and you've mapped out the gestalt, and you see, okay, the gestalt is falling into place. In the initial stages of a technology, I recommend not actually getting into it. Watch it closely, keep an eye on it, but you don't need to invest. It's really not that useful. Only once the technology gets closer to maturity, you actually want to have it inform strategy. And this is the moment when you want to deploy the third set of filters. Again, remember, the first one was maturity of the technology. Second one is the gestalt. And the third one is the question of how high is the utility, or how useful is this product even? And the way we like to think about usefulness is we like to apply the following triptych. We look at a technology, like something which solves a problem, and we ask ourselves 3 dimensions: frequency, density, friction. Frequency, how often do we encounter this problem? Is it something we only encounter once a year, or is it something you encounter every single day? Density, how long or deep is our engagement with the problem? Is this something which only takes half a second for you, or is it something which, like you spend hours in the problem space? And lastly, friction. How much pain does this experience give you? Is it just a little bit? Is it just like a benign problem? Or is it a really hard problem for you to look at? And that's your last filter. And I give you a good example. If you're familiar with NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and you see what's happening in that space at the moment, I would very clearly say that frequency, density, and friction of that space is very, very, very low. So my argument would be to say that at least the current way we see these non-fungible tokens being rolled out and being used, I'm not quite sure if there's actually enough utility for it to really break through. So that's your third lens, your third filter you want to apply. And then of course, once you get to this tipping point, you definitely need to want to act. So 3 filters to look at a strong signal: maturity and scalable, gestalt, and the utility, the usefulness this thing actually gives you. Now, I want to bring us kind of full circle back to our friend Jorge Polo Lehmann, the person I quoted at the very beginning, because remember, he said the word disruption. And we've talked about weak signals. We've talked about how weak signals emerge into strong signals, and those will lead to disruption. And here's the thing. Disruption is this really fascinating, interesting concept. I think it's actually rather meaningless these days. We became obsessed talking about disruption, analyzing it. For the last 4 years, I've been doing nothing but really thinking about this and creating models around this. Because the thing for me is that disruption is it's being used a lot, it's being thrown around like crazy, but it's rather meaningless as a concept. So let's unpack this. And let me give you a different perspective, a different model to think about disruption. This is the earliest definition you can find for the word disruption. And by the way, the word disruption comes out of the field of medicine, medical use. This is a definition from about 500 years ago. And it said disruption is a rending asunder, a bursting apart, a forcible separation into parts. And I think that's a pretty good starting point. And here's the thing. People like myself, they love to tell you a story about, when we talk about disruption, about Kodak, Blockbuster, or Nokia, these American or international companies. And if you're anything like me, you just want to throw up in your mouth a little bit because you heard that story so many times. It's always the same story. Kodak got disrupted by, like ultimately Instagram, but the digital camera, despite the fact that Kodak invented the digital camera. Blockbuster got disrupted by Netflix. Totally decimated by Netflix, despite the fact that they had multiple opportunities to buy Netflix. And Nokia, the purveyor of mobile phones, got disrupted and destroyed by Apple and Google and, all the Android smartphone manufacturers. Here's the thing. We have a weird obsession to look at the disruptors, the Netflixes of this world, and ask ourselves, what is it we can learn from these companies? And make no mistake, there's lots which can be learned from these companies. But I think we're missing an important part. And that leads us to a different view on disruption. Because here's the thing. People, and this goes back to Clayton Christensen, the management theory researcher, like truly one of the greats we have. People don't buy products or services. What people do is they hire them to make progress in specific circumstances. This is a concept which Clayton Christensen called the job to be done. We ask of our products to help us to do a job. And the important insight is this. In every single disruption story, the underlying job to be done has never changed. It always stayed the same. You're still taking pictures. You're taking way more pictures actually than ever before. At the height of the Blockbuster empire, Kodak empire. At the height of the Kodak empire, Kodak sold 1 billion rolls of film. Let's say that's like 36 pictures on a film. That's 36 billion pictures we took. Today, we're taking about 1.6 trillion pictures. You're still watching movies. It just happened to be that these movies don't come on a VHS video cassette, which you get from a movie store. They get streamed straight to your television. You're still communicating. The thing is, the underlying job to be done hasn't changed. The way we fulfill that job has changed. And make no mistake, the reason why we love talking about disruption so much is because disruption is high drama. It sounds awesome. But the notion that things work the way they work because there's a certain logic to them, that's just not high drama. And that's the reason why I want to offer you a different perspective. And I think it's a very useful one. It's one we have deployed to every single one of our clients who are now using this to make sense of the world. We think about disruption as what we like to call a state change. And state changes, you might be familiar with, is a concept coming out of the world of physics. Very simply expressed, here's the simple state change. If you take water, when water is frozen, it's solid, it's ice. You warm it, it becomes liquid. You warm it further, it becomes gas. The in-between, when it goes from one form to the next, is what is called a state change. And the reason why we think this metaphor, this analog, works so well is twofold. One, the underlying molecule, H2O, has actually never changed. Regardless of the state, it's always H2O. The underlying job to be done we ask from our products never changed. The way we fulfill it changed. The second reason why we like this so much is that state changes don't happen on a nice linear curve. They happen typically on these slightly exponential curves. Think about boiling water. The situation where you put water into a pot, you crank up the heat, you're waiting for it to boil, it starts to bubble, and the moment you turn around, it will boil over. Now, here's what's important to understand about a state. in every state, and remember, the state is the way you fulfill a customer's need today. In every state, there's a phase of stability. This is where if you are the incumbent, you make all your money, nobody can come like even close to you, you build a moat around your castle, you protect yourself, the world is good. If you are a startup, you don't want to be attacking right now because it's not the right time. It's really hard to do. But then there's gradual changes you can see. This is where the weak signals play in. This is where you can see the state changing, the way the world is being delivered, the services are being done. That changes. And then eventually, if the weak signals turn into strong signals, you get to a sudden change, a sudden shift. Remember, gradually and then suddenly. And let me show you in one example why this is so important and where it matters. Let's talk about Blockbuster. If you are familiar with Blockbuster, Blockbuster was a video rental store company, the largest in the world, headquartered in the United States. And what they did is they rented out VHS video cassettes. And at the height of the Blockbuster empire, there were some 9,000 Blockbuster stores all around the United States. Famously, it was said that within, like, regardless where you are, in any urban destination, there's a Blockbuster store in 10 minutes or less. Now, here's the important thing to understand about Blockbuster. Blockbuster isn't an entertainment company, or wasn't an entertainment company. Blockbuster, at the end of the day, is a real estate company. They know way better than anyone else where exactly to put one of those stores, how to merchandise these stores, how close they need to be each other, can be from each other, so you're still maximizing your revenue. Blockbuster was a world champion at real estate. The same can be said about McDonald's, for example, or Starbucks. Starbucks isn't a coffee company per se. Starbucks is a real estate company. But here's the interesting thing. The state changed. We went from VHS video cassettes to DVDs. And DVDs are interesting because DVDs, they're like much smaller, they're thin, you don't need to rewind them, they're more robust, the video quality is better, yada, yada, yada. And once you take a DVD in your hand, and this is of course the starting point for our friends at Netflix, once you take a DVD in your hand, you realize that a DVD can be shipped and you can solve one of the bigger problems, which is, despite the fact that there's a Blockbuster 10 minutes away from you, it's still for you 10 minutes into the car, getting your movie, getting back. It's an hour-long trip. Also, very often when you walked into that store, they never had the movie you actually wanted to see because it was rented out already. So Netflix started their mail order company. And here's the important thing. What Netflix created was a mail order company. In a mail order company, it is absolutely, what's now relevant is, where do I put my warehouse? How do I run this like factory-like operation? How do I negotiate with companies like USPS or FedEx or USPS, the mail order companies? If you're Blockbuster, you realize that overnight, your existing skills and processes have become irrelevant. Let me repeat that because I think that's the most important thing I can tell you about state changes. Your existing skills and processes have become irrelevant. And that is incredibly hard to manage as you go from one state to the next. You don't need to know how to run a store. You don't need to know where to put a store if you run a mail order company. And of course, the state changed once more. We went from DVDs to streaming media. And once we went to streaming media, the world changed again. And the sole reason why Netflix could actually deal with this the way they did is because Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, knew that streaming is the destination. He knew that the DVD is just an in-between state. It will change towards streaming. So he could prepare himself for a world where he didn't need to run a mail order company anymore. He now needed to run a streaming service. And, like he needed to negotiate with Hollywood and he needed to hire software programmers. So very different skills. But again, the only reason why they could navigate this transition so beautifully was because they knew it was coming. Which brings us to the last point, and this is where I want to end our conversation tonight, or for me, my night, your morning, so your morning, which is, how do you actually show up as a leader? So remember, we talked about practical futurism. We talked about weak signals, strong signals. We talked about disruption just now. And now the question comes, how do you actually show up as a leader, as an individual in this world? Because here's the thing. We're living in a world which undoubtedly has an increase in uncertainty. This is the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, for decades now, publishes something called the World Uncertainty Index. And what they're doing effectively is, it's rather interesting. They're actually looking at how often do companies and countries report in their communication the word uncertainty or related words. And they index this and create an index. And what you can see is, of course, the index skyrocketed at the beginning of the pandemic. But more importantly, over a 30-year period, uncertainty is on the rise. And if I can tell you one thing for certain, that is, uncertainty will continue to rise. And here's the problem with uncertainty. In a world of a higher increased uncertainty, in a world of where uncertainty becomes the norm, you don't have the answers anymore. And that is deeply troubling because, quite frankly, the way we typically create our careers, the way we got graded in school, is by having the answer. This is what has been drilled into our heads. But we're living in a world where we don't have the answers anymore because we're living in a world of high complexity and high uncertainty. And here's what I postulate. In this world, in this new world in which we are already in, but the world we're moving into in the future for sure, you actually don't need to have the answers anymore. It's actually not that valuable. As Jonas Salk once said, what people think of as the moment of discovery is really the discovery of the question. So instead of finding answers, what we should actually get better at is asking questions, asking better questions of the future. And there's a beautiful book by Warren Berger. Highly recommend this book. It's called A More Beautiful Question. And in the book, he points something out. He says that in a world of global complexity, the value of a discrete answer actually diminishes. It goes down. Whereas the value of a good question actually increases. So I do think that what we need to train ourselves on is to actually ask better questions of this world. In many ways, I believe that the most important skill you can train, you can lean into, the skill of the 21st century is curiosity. Here's an interesting way to think about curiosity. I mentioned to you earlier, I was born in Germany. The Germans have an interesting word for curiosity. The German word for curiosity is Neugier. And very similar to most German words, it's a combinatorial word. It's a word which consists of two parts, which have been, brought together. The first part, neu, means new. And the second part, gier, means greed. And my invitation for you is to actually become greedy for newness, for new information. And here's the thing. Every child, we were born curious. We were born with Neugier. The challenge is that we got it beaten out of us in school. So what we need to do is we need to reconnect with our inner child and start asking questions. We should start asking questions like, why? What if? How might we? Because those are the most powerful questions you can ask of the future, because they will open up all of those horizons. It will open up your understanding of weak and strong signals and disruption. And I want to offer you one more question for this. And this one comes from a dear friend of mine. This is Guy Kawasaki. Guy Kawasaki he was the first evangelist at Apple. He's an incredibly smart person. And 10 years ago, he gifted me a question. He gave me a question as a present. And that question is probably the most powerful question I think you can ask. As you're going through your life, if you're seeing something which feels off, weird, different, instead of looking away, instead of saying, oh, this is, you're like your pattern recognition doesn't see it, you ignore it, ask yourself, isn't that interesting? And here's the very practical tip I will have for you. I'm a rower. And if you know anything about rowing, or like you know the sport of rowing, there's a very famous story in rowing, which is the man's eight, which is the king discipline of rowing, did not win any international races for decades, which is a huge shame for the United Kingdom because they love their rowing. They had a new coach who prepared the team back in the day for the Sydney Olympics. And what that coach did is, instead of going to his team and saying, we're going to train hard and we're getting these like big gains, he said, all I care about is we're making 1% improvements to everything we do. So we will become 1% better at our stroke. We will become 1% better at our power output. We will become 1% better at the way we navigate the boat through the water. We will become 1% better at our rate of stroke, etc., etc. And what he did is, every single time, when you add those 1%, you actually get to exponential increases in your knowledge. And here's the thing I offer you. Take that question, the isn't that interesting question from my friend Guy Kawasaki, and for the next year, ask that question once a day. Just ask it once a day. Go through your life, see something online, in the real world, in your job, at your university, something a friend mentions, and stop and pause and reflect on it and ask yourself, isn't that interesting? Lean into your curiosity. Here's a interesting fact. If you do this 365 times and 90% of those things don't end up going anywhere, they were just like dead ends, who cares, nothing happens, but 10% actually turn into something, you have gained 36 new interesting insights, which is 36 more than I guarantee you most people will have. And here is the invitation for you. Uncertainty truly becomes a window. It is a window into a world of possibilities. So embrace it and see it as an opening window for you. Now, I want to end on a quote. We opened with a quote. I want to end with a quote. The gentleman you see here is another friend of ours, a gentleman called Ron Shaich. Ron is the founder of a company called Panera Bread. Panera is a healthy fast food chain in the United States. He sold that company for $7.6 billion US, which is a massive, humongous multiple over what you would normally get for a company like his. And I sat down with him and we had dinner one day, which, by the way, he paid for. He's much richer than I am. And I asked him, Ron, how did you do this? What is the magic formula for you? And if you know Panera Bread, Panera was very early in all of these tech trends. Panera had fully digitized ordering systems before anyone else. They had a home order system before anyone else. They digitized their supply chain before anyone else. And he said something really remarkable to me. He said to me, Pascal, our approach at Panera has always been to discover today what will matter tomorrow, and then to transform our company into a future that is unfolding before us. And I think that is exactly what we collectively have to do as practical futurists. We need to figure out what matters tomorrow, today. And then once we can see that, we now have a future in front of us. We can see and we can take our company, our families, our society, and take them on this path towards the future we now can see. My last invitation for you, and then I will stop and I will see if you have got any questions. My last invitation, if you want to stay in touch, we share all of our research on a public mailing list. You simply send an empty email to this email address, hello@b-radical.xyz. You will automatically be added to that mailing list. We send out this email once a week. We do a few members only, invite only events, which we do for our people. Plus, you will get also an email automatically from me with all my personal contact details, because I would love to stay in touch, because this here can only be the beginning of a journey. Now, that is what I have for you. Again, thank you so much for having me. And I will look at my gracious host and see if we have time and if there are any questions, because I'm very happy to hang around and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, sir, for such an enlightening session. Now I would like audience to ask any questions if they have.
Hi, Pastor. I enjoyed your talk a lot. So I was during this during your story, during your vision, I was thinking about um, a new tech which is they are trying to develop. I think you have heard about breakthrough field. So do you think that idea of singularity or maybe the thing which he wants to design, the technique he wants to use to expand human life is it a weak signal or a strong one?
I am very sorry. I had a really hard time understanding the question. If you could I ask you probably, I mean, I'm very cheeky here, but could you use the podium microphone probably? I'm so sorry.
Can you hear me?
I hear you now loud and clear. That's perfect. Thank you.
So, my name is Deepak. I'm also into the tech field. So during our conversation, I was thinking about a new tech which Ray Kurzweil wants to develop. I think you are well aware of that. So is it a weak signal or a strong signal to expand human life maybe for next 100 years or so?
That's a really good question. I think it depends. It really depends on what is the particular approach. So I think it is definitely a strong signal if you think about human life extension by, for example, first of all, solving a lot of the issues we know are currently keeping or which make people die, right? So think about like many diseases, like cancer, for example. You also can think about nutrition and similar aspects. There is some promising research into some medications. For example, there's a medication called metformin, which is typically being used, I believe, for diabetics. That's where it came from. But it seems to have life-expanding properties. So I think that is a strong signal. There's a lot happening here, and quite clearly, it solves the real problem. It solves the ultimate problem, which is, people dying. And, most of us want to live longer. I am a little more skeptical about some of the more extreme approaches where, like some people talk about expanding life beyond, like 120, 130, 140 years old. I think that is still very much in the space of unproven, unscalable technology. So we'll see. The jury is out on it. It's definitely an interesting space to watch. And, clearly we should all have a natural interest in it because it affects us personally very directly.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
I hear you loud and clear.
Yes. Sir, you said like the world is evolving very fast. So at times, do you feel that at some point of time we are missing out on something which we enjoyed in the past? Like, for example, we are downloading a song which is on, say, Apple Music instantly. So I used to collect some 50 CDs I have of one music director of in Indian cinema. After 2016, I'm missing that fun. But even though I'm enjoying the songs which are being heard in the thing. So do you feel that sometimes we are going very faster than required? And another question is, why didn't you get the strong signal when you people went ahead with Google Lens, even though like you said, good things take time?
Yeah.
So why couldn't it be a possibility to invent? Because it would have been very cool to see many persons hang out with Google Lens, but I don't think so. People who are already having Lens, there might have been a problem. But I feel so that it would have been a great thing. Like even you said, Steve Jobs, everything takes time to evolve. Why didn't that evolve? Even though we have something called Glass Enterprise Edition 2 right now in
Yeah.
Google. But that for that we should even request a price. We don't even have the price, even though we have the specifications of it. These two questions are made.
Yeah, perfect. Love the questions. Let me answer them in order. So for your first question, are we missing out because like stuff happens so fast? Yeah, absolutely. I believe what happens though is that, and this goes back to human psychology. We have, as humans, we have a tendency to jump on these new things and then kind of forget what we lost. As you mentioned, like the joy of like browsing through CDs or something. What then happens though is very often there's a remembering of, wait a second, there is a piece of, like an Apple Music or Spotify, which I really enjoy, which is this like, oh, I can have any song, anytime, anywhere, and like I've got it instantly, which is great. But as you pointed out, sometimes I want to listen to and want to browse through my record label, like my record collection, right? So it's fascinating because when you look today, and you seem to know, some about music. When you look at the music business, vinyl, so the old records, not even CDs, vinyl, have a complete like revival. Like there's a bunch of people like yourself maybe who say, you know what, it's great. I love this enjoyment. So I think the way I would like to think about these changes is that they present us with options, with opportunities and options. And if we're smart about this, we actually get the best of both worlds. Because when we're smart about this, you can have on one hand the song instantly downloaded to your phone whenever you want it right here. And then on the flip side of that, when you are in the comfort of your home and you want to browse through your vinyl collection, there's now new vinyl being released. So I think I'm not too negative about this. I think it's a very natural reaction for us to like jump on stuff and kind of like jump on the new thing and forget about the old thing. But there's a remembering about this as well. So that's at least my perspective on the first one. The second question about specifically about Google Glass and maybe broadly speaking augmented reality, etc. I believe Google Glass was, and I'm very happy to follow up with you on this. Like, there's a million reasons why Google Glass was like destined to fail. It was just like way too early. Like the technology wasn't there. It's a classic. I mean, there's a million things which Google Glass needed to solve, which at the time they couldn't. And arguably, probably even today you can't. But that being said, you can see a clear path towards it. So I do believe that we will see a version of, augmented reality glasses, whoever makes them. It might be Google, it might be Apple, it might be a completely different company. But we will see augmented reality glasses as a very useful way for us to interact with computer interfaces. Because generally speaking, it's actually a really great idea to have a little computer on my glasses. Like you and I, we wear glasses. So, having information laid into this, for example, would be amazing. When I like even something stupid as just walking information if I need to find a destination. So this will come. I'm 100% sure it will come. I just think that Google Glass was easily, 10 years too early. And the interesting thing is, when you looked at Google Glass, when Google Glass came out, and you would have applied our framework to it, you would have very quickly seen that it's just too early. And, it was very clear. And the interesting thing is, and I'll end on this one for this comment here, I know a whole bunch of people who were part of the team which developed Google Glass. And the irony is that they told Google that this is way too early. It's a prototype. It's like a technical feasibility study. It's not a product. But Google chose, for various reasons, to treat it like a product, which it clearly wasn't. And that's the reason why, it flopped so badly. But we will see augmented reality glasses. There's absolutely no doubt, because they actually do make a lot of sense.
Thank you so much for this amazing session. Yes, ma'am. Sir, I believe that we share a common interest. That is the concept of new tech more than the new technology. So I would like to know your ideas about metaverse.
Oh my God. Really?
Really, sir? Yeah.
Okay. Oh man. Where do we begin? So let me start first with, I believe you need to distinguish between the broader concept of a metaverse, meaning we live our lives in an online world, or conduct some of our lives in an online world, versus what Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook, shows you what they think the metaverse is. So I would make the argument that we are already living in the metaverse. Like, you're already spending a good chunk of your time in front of digital devices. You know, we communicate through them, we shop through them, we get entertained through them, we listen to music through them, as we already heard. So I would say, to a certain extent, we're living in the metaverse. If you look at kids, if they're on Roblox or, you know, like Minecraft or something, they're already in the metaverse. Now, the particular version of the metaverse which the company Meta shows you, like this idea that you put on these like virtual reality goggles and you plug yourself into the matrix, quite frankly, and pardon my language here, I think that's largely bullshit. I think you will do this for very specific use cases. You know, when you want to be like, I don't know, like you want to go and play a game, for example, you want to be entertained, maybe. But the idea that you walk into an office and you put on these glasses for 8 hours, and like, it's just like, makes no sense to me whatsoever. So I would say the metaverse conversation is a very nuanced one. You really need to look at it as from multiple different angles. And I think personally, I think the vision, at least, which is being put forward by Meta, the company, I'm not buying. Now, that being said, there's a lot happening in the metaverse space, which I think is super interesting. And ultimately, I also think that augmented reality, as we talked about earlier, is actually much more useful than virtual reality, because augmented reality still allows me to be with you in person, in a setting, but I get all the benefits of these compute devices, these inputs, these pieces of information, etc. So with that being said, that's kind of like my short version. And by all means, like, if you ever want to geek out on like the metaverse, like, just hook me up. I gladly rent on for it for hours.
Definitely, sir. Definitely, I will. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, hello Pascal, I'm Pallavi. So my question is also related to metaverse. We all are, speeding up in technology. We are only thinking about the positive side. But I am a faculty in the area of organization behavior also, psychology also, I understand.
Perfect.
So is it not creating psychological, or will it not create psychological problems later on? Because I read an article in MIT Technological Review, which talked about, it might be harmful for the mental health of adolescents, because suppose if they're playing games, just like you mentioned here, so they would be having their avatars, and there are and sometimes, just like social media, they would not be representing a true self of themselves.
Yeah.
So it would be creating a fictional version of themselves, and there were articles related to sexual harassment in this metaverse. So is it not going to create more problems because of so that was my question. Psychological problems related to this.
Yeah, I love that you bring up this question, and I think it's a really important question to consider and to take into account and to take serious. I do believe that we as a collective, as an industry, as people in the industry, we need to become much more conscious about the power we wield with our creations. And I absolutely agree. This goes back to social media, for example, as well, where like there is lots which is good about social media, and there's a huge amount of stuff which isn't good about social media, right? And if you think about like teenagers, I mean, we know like cyberbullying, self-image issues. You might have seen in the United States there just recently was a big debate about Instagram and what this means for particular young girls and their self-image. And I do think that there is a responsibility on the side of the creators of these platforms, of these tools, etc., which we need to take serious. And I think, unfortunately, at least until now, there was a bit of a laissez-faire version of this, which is like, oh, this is not our problem. We just create the technology. And there's a falsehood, which is technology is neither good nor bad. You know, like people say this, oh yes, but technology doesn't, like, that's not the problem. That is a falsehood. I think that's not actually true. Like, if you create the technology, there is a responsibility for you to do, like, to think about this. Now, luckily, I think that we as an industry at large starting to wake up to this. Like, you see many more people like yourself bringing this up. We have much more conversation. You mentioned the MIT article, which I also read, by the way. It's a really good piece of like writing and journalism. So I do think that we need to bring up these questions. And I believe the place where we need to have the conversation particularly is in the creation of those tools and really thinking about and bringing in, by the way, there's a real problem with us not bringing in enough voices into the creation process. So as long as, like, pardon my language here, as long as this is a bunch of white Stanford educated dudes sitting in a room creating the technology, I'm not surprised that the technology looks the way it looks like, right? So we need to bring more diverse voices and opinions and insights to the table to make sure that we create actually wholesome, good experiences. And yes, technology there is risks, without a doubt.